Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum, and I hope that you are all having a wonderful weekend. Today is July 12th, and I figured that since last week I reviewed Sing Street, which is one of my favorite musicals, and one of my favorite love stories, that today we could do a little bit of a lovey-dovey episode. So that's the theme for today. It's going to be a romance-based episode. All of the films are going to center around that. So what films are we talking about today? The first one is a newer film on Netflix called The Lovebirds. Then I'm going to be reviewing my weekly watch, which was Catfish, a documentary from the late 2000s, late aughts. And then my weekly recommendation is 500 Days of Summer, which is one of my favorite films of all time, regardless of theme. And then my final segment, the more creative segment, I had a lot of fun talking about Afro-Surrealism, so I thought I'd do another little bit of a history lesson relevant to rom-coms and specifically to 500 Days of Summer. And I'm going to be talking about the trope of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, what it is, its implications in film, and why it is probably on the outs. So that's today's episode. I'm very excited to talk about it. Romance films are some of my favorite films to watch and hopefully to review. So that's the episode, and let's get into it. Alright, so The Lovebirds is a Netflix film. It was released on May 22nd. It stars Kumail Nanjiani and Issa Rae. It follows a couple, Gerard and Leilani, who, after a feud in their relationship that might boil over to a breakup, they witness a homicide that they are directly involved in, coincidentally, and given some of their suspicious activity at the crime scene, have to evade the police and solve the mystery on their own. So it's a clever premise up front. There are similar movies to it. It is kind of that genre, kind of all-in-one night mystery films. Think Game Night. It's very reminiscent of that film. And it's funny that it's on Netflix. I'll give a little bit of a mini history lesson on this film. So this is a Paramount produced film, and it was originally scheduled for release. I know if you're somebody who goes to the movie theaters a lot, I saw the trailer before like every movie. So they were heavily marketing this film, and after COVID-19 hit, they had to change their plans, and so it was sold to Netflix. And I actually do think that is a benefit to this film. It is. I always kind of say what I'm thinking before I start reviewing it. It's okay. It's nothing special. It's not terrible, but it's also not great by any means. And so because of that, I think if I had gone to see it in the theater, I would have been a lot more disappointed. There's no necessity to see it on the big screen. In fact, it might be a little bit underproduced compared to some of the films of the same vein, same genre. I couldn't help but compare it to Game Night, ultimately, which is a similar murder mystery all-in-one night couple movie. And Game Night, I think, has a stronger script, a stronger story to tell. The comedy is a bit stronger, a bit more fleshed out. So I actually think that this serves itself well on Netflix. The only major downside is that for a film like this, you want to have the communal aspect of laughing along with everybody. And there are definitely some comedic moments that I feel like are lost watching it at home, where you don't get the communal. If I was watching it in a crowd with a lot of people, if they were laughing, I would probably be laughing too. So there's a lot of watching it at home, you kind of snort through your nose. You're like, oh, okay, that's kind of funny. But there's not the laugh out loud factor. And I will say that segues kind of nicely into the screenplay itself. So let's start there. I think the comedy is subpar. It's like right in the middle. And I only say that because a movie like this relies heavily on improvisation. Even I kind of compared it to Eurovision too, because it's like an improv sketch comedy thing. This works much better as a film as opposed to a sketch, but it's the same tone of comedy. And this film, because it relies so heavily on improvisation, there are a lot of bits that feel forced or feel as though they are being oversold. They're overdone, where a bit will go on a little bit too long. And I actually watched an interview with Kumail and Issa Rae, and Kumail was saying how in films like this, they might improv riff in the first take, but given the camera setups not getting everybody, they have to kind of recreate that improvisation. And I actually think that's where some of the downside happens. This is specifically talking about the Lovebirds. I don't know if this is the case for other films, but a lot of that kind of lends itself to it feeling forced ultimately. So they might have been really natural in their improvisation on the first take, and then by the time we see it in the film on the fifth, sixth take, it doesn't feel nearly as natural and doesn't flow nearly as well. So that being said, there are also some bits in the film that are pretty clearly not improved, because they serve as more of a motif for the film. The one that comes to mind is there is a specific sort of ongoing joke motif thing about The Amazing Race, and realistically it only comes up in the beginning and the end. I would have liked that motif to come through a little bit more often, and there is sort of the idea that throughout the film they kind of are on an amazing race, but I would have liked that to be a little bit more apparent. And even when they mention it at the beginning, it's one of those things where you hear it and you're like, that's going to come back later. There's kind of no sense of it being a natural evolution of what the characters are talking about. It doesn't seem to flow very naturally in terms of the script. I think it works. I think there are ways that it could have flowed well, but it's just not executed to the standard that I think a lot of comedies like this work. Additionally, a lot of the events in the film, so not the jokes, but the actual events in the film, feel very coincidental, which is usually not a good way for us to root for the characters if they simply are falling into these things going on. All of the scenes are sort of loosely tied together by coincidental moments, and there are points where I will say that Issa Rae and Kumail Nanjiani, both of their characters, have a solid amount of agency in the story. So although some of the events are coincidental when they're in those events, they tend to act with a lot of agency and have the power to change what's going on. So that's a way for us to root for the characters, and I will say that those two characters were much stronger than any other characters in the film. But just a lot of sort of the plot is stitched together a little bit too loosely for my liking. So although the characters have agency within the scenes themselves are not tied together very strongly from a narrative standpoint. Additionally, the way that they are tied together is a little bit predictable. You can definitely tell where this film is going. So there's no surprises really happening. There's one surprise kind of towards the end, but it's a twist. I hesitate to say twist because it's just sort of more of a plot development that undermines a lot of the events from earlier in the film and makes them a little bit more pointless, a little bit useless, which is unfortunate. But I will say at least I didn't know that it was heading that direction, which is nice. There's also this added tension between the couple, of breaking up, where they kind of mention that they're going to break up within the first 10-15 minutes of the film. And they kind of weave that in a little bit throughout the rest of the film, and it feels very unnecessary. You get the sense before they even have that discussion that their relationship is somewhat stale, and I think it would have been a little bit more interesting if they had stayed together or had no intention of breaking up, and really just reignited that spark throughout what was going on in the film as opposed to mending the relationship. It feels like an added level of stakes that don't actually add anything. You would have had that same level of nuance in a more committed relationship, a relationship that wasn't necessarily on the rocks, but just kind of stale, bland, no romance left, and reigniting that romance would have made the movie a little bit more romantic in my mind. But that might be a little bit more of a nitpick, because it could kind of go either way. I could see other people not feeling that way. But moving on to the acting, the best part about this film is Issa Rae and Kumail Nanjiani. They are both phenomenal comedic actors. I would recommend both of their television shows, Insecure, Issa Rae, and Silicon Valley, Kumail Nanjiani. But they are phenomenal comedic actors, and what is really nice is when great comedic actors have great chemistry together. So they have very solid chemistry, particularly comedic chemistry. Their timing works really well together. I would say that their comedic chemistry is a little bit stronger than their romantic chemistry, but I also think that that's just how the film works. I don't think it focused a lot more on the comedy than it did the romance. So they have some good bits together. You can tell that they're having fun, even when some of their improvisation is a little bit forced. You can tell that it comes from a much more creative, a much more fun place in their minds. And that being said, those are the only characters that are standouts. All of the side characters are forgettable. They don't have any character traits that make them stand out from anybody else. We don't get any moments of interest in any other secondary character, no amount of significant screen time, which is fine, but given that the film relies so heavily on this murder mystery plot, and intriguing, fascinating things going on, it would have been nice to have some secondary characters with a little bit of a stronger character in general, because they're all somewhat forgettable. And the other thing that goes along with that, is because of the fact that none of the other characters are established very well, the relationships between those characters and our two leads are also not established very well. There's a scene where Kumail's character Gerard is very jealous of a coworker from Leilani, and it's told to us and never shown to us in any way. It seems almost a little bit out of place in his character that he would be so jealous given the character that we've seen so far. And it would have been nice to see some moments of where that feud might have come from, or the relationship between that coworker and Leilani. But so the fact that the secondary characters are not nearly as strong as our leads and not nearly as fleshed out actually weakens some of the moments from our lead characters too. So I will say that that is not a very strong positive. So as far as the acting goes, the two leads are pretty fantastic, when sort of their bits are not as forced as they should be, maybe the times where they're improvising a little bit more naturally. But their chemistry is very nice, and I have to say that a lot of their character moments, I think the legwork is done on them through the improv as opposed to the screenplay, so that's more of a credit, I feel, to those two actors. The strongest thing about this film, though, in my mind, was the production design. In a film that takes place in one night, in one city, not necessarily one location, but that same kind of environment, no nuance as far as daylight goes, you have to kind of have a strong production design, a strong sense of aesthetic to get people interested in sort of the backdrops. And that's something that Eurovision lacked that I would say this one actually brought to the table. There are some interesting set pieces of where they go. I'm sure if you've seen the trailer, there's a kind of a cult thing going on. That's a really fun set piece. There's a police station, there's a dock, there's an apartment with a lot of lights, and they're in New Orleans, so there is sort of the street lights. That New Orleans color scheme, Mardi Gras color scheme, kind of makes itself known throughout the film. So I would say that the production design is very solid, and additionally, the costuming is pretty solid. There is a strong sense of trying to make solid iconography for Leilani and Gerard. They wear very eccentric clothing because they have to get rid of some of their more normal clothing. And as much as that seems from the trailer that it might not work, I think it actually works in its favor. It makes us a little bit more interested in what they got going on. And you can see the shift in their characters going from a stagnant relationship to a little bit more of an eccentric, fun thing going on despite the actual, stakes of it all. So I really liked the costuming, and I would say the set pieces, production design were also pretty strong. So then the cinematography does not translate to how the production design was. Cinematography is relatively simple. A lot of comedies they're not focused on cinematography necessarily, so much like Eurovision. I'm sorry that I keep comparing it to Eurovision. If you haven't listened to that episode, I would go back and just listen to that review. It's last episode, first 15 minutes. But just similar style of comedy, and I would say that the Lovebirds is a little bit stronger than Eurovision. But anyway, that out of the way, comedies tend to rely on two shots where it's sort of over the shoulder. You get the shoulder from the character that's not speaking, and you get to watch the character that is speaking, and it's just sort of a back and forth, and then a wide shot to add some coverage of everything else that's going on. And so it's fairly boring, nothing interesting going on. But I will say that the action was a little bit quicker, a little bit more fun. And so because the rest of it was a little bit boring, it actually enhances some of the action, despite the action maybe not being choreographed as well as obviously action movies. They're not as focused on that, given that it's a comedy, but it does actually elevate the action, given that the two-shot is a little bit blander. So that is actually a positive coming out of a negative, but if you don't care about cinematography, there's that, nothing to worry about. As far as the editing goes, I think the scene work is really nice. So cutting in between the two characters, I think, works pretty functionally. There are a few interesting cuts going on in the middle of the scenes, but transitioning between scenes, nothing interesting. It tends to be an overhead shot of the city with some music going on. So that's another pretty typical thing that happens in comedies like this. So the flow between the scenes is somewhat poor, and sometimes it is even jarring given the tonal shift of certain scenes. So between scenes it doesn't flow as well. The pacing gets a little bit monotonous, but the scene work actually works pretty well, and I have to say that's probably more of a credit to the actors. Finally, with the sound, nothing interesting coming from the score. Just a pretty, it fits whatever scene is happening, telling the audience how to feel. Nothing super innovative. The soundtrack, though, is fairly fun. There are some fun pop songs to it. There's also a TikTok song in it, so if you're somebody who's on TikTok, you might recognize that and might actually take you out of the film. I know I recognized it. But it is a good song, so that was nice. And then as far as the directing goes, there are some solid moments of tension weaved throughout the comedy, which I actually was surprised by how tense some of those moments were. But overall, the film itself is not all that focused tonally. A lot of those bits, again, feel forced. And I think a lot of the legwork from the directing and the screenplay actually comes from the two lead actors. But that's the film itself. It's a fairly forgettable film. I think it's enjoyable if you're watching it with a large group of people. If you're watching it alone, I think there are stronger comedies to watch. But if you do want to watch something new, Issa Rae and Kumail Nanjiani are two actors who have a very well-established fan base and a lot of very, very good projects that are only going to get stronger, and they're only going to soar throughout Hollywood, and I can see them becoming A-list actors within the next couple years. So I would recommend it just for those two. But other than that, nothing that stands out all that much, so I'm going to give this one a strong 4 out of 10. It's perfectly mediocre. The actors stand out, but nothing really innovative throughout the rest of the filmmaking. So that's The Lovebirds. It's streaming on Netflix right now. And next up, I'm going to be reviewing Catfish, which is a documentary. And then finally, my weekly recommendation is 500 Days of Summer. But stay tuned until the very end, where I give a little bit of an explanation on the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope. But for right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of The Lovebirds, streaming right now on Netflix. I will now be giving my weekly watch, which was Catfish, also streaming on Netflix, not quite as new. And finally, my weekly recommendation, which is 500 Days of Summer. And then stay tuned until the very end, where I give a little bit of a history lesson on the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope. So this week, my weekly watch was Catfish, which is a documentary from 2010. It follows two filmmakers who are following their best friend, Neve Schulman, who has embarked on an internet relationship with a young woman named Megan that he has never met. And throughout the relationship, he decides to go visit her where she lives, and you will never guess what happens next. And that's the truth. That's part of the fun of it all. You won't guess what happens at all. So most people, I think, are familiar with the television show, which is hosted by Neve Schulman on MTV, called Catfish, where if you are unfamiliar with the term catfish, it basically is surrounding online dating, and it basically means if you are looking at the pictures of somebody and then you go to meet them and they don't look like their pictures or are somebody completely different, you have been catfished. That's what the term is. It comes from this film, and I will say that I was completely blown away by this documentary. It is streaming for free on Netflix. It's only an hour and a half. I highly, highly recommend it. I did not really know what to expect. I'd seen episodes of the television show. Although Neve is seemingly a very down-to-earth guy, pretty genuine, the show is a reality show, so it's by nature pretty exploitative. It is fun, don't get me wrong. It's a fun reality series, and I think there are pretty down-to-earth moments. I think it's met with a lot of kindness, it seems, at least. So that's kind of what I was expecting from the documentary. A little bit hokey, maybe a little cheesy, maybe a little even malicious at times. But that is not what I got at all. It is really hard to talk about the story of this film without spoiling it. So I'm going to go over everything else from a more filmmaking technical standpoint, and then I'll start talking about the story, and I will tell you when I start to give spoilers, but I'm going to try and do that at the very end. Because if you have not seen it, I do not recommend listening to my spoilers. It is best to go in blind. And it is also something that I think anybody can really get something out of. So I would recommend it to anybody. It's pretty short. You can come back and listen to my thoughts afterwards. Cause it'll be fairly opinion based, I think, when I get to the more spoiler territory. But let's talk about some of the more technical aspects first, because it is a very well made documentary. It is made by two guys from New York named Ariel Schulman, Neve's brother, and Henry Joost, and they're very good at what they do. They make a very good documentary. Some of the best aspects of it to me was the cinematography. So it feels like it's a very real documentary. It's shot in real time. All of the people in it feel very genuine, and it seems to be shot in a fairly objective way, but the camera is very personal. It is very intimate. With everybody. There isn't somebody who stands out to me as far as who they want to focus on more. It's obviously about Neve, but every other character that exists in the story is met with the same level of personal closeness, intimacy that the camera shows you, and that adds to, I think, the level of sympathy that we feel for these characters, and we really relate to a lot of the characters, which is really, really nice. Additionally, a lot of the film is shot in fairly low quality cameras. So it's from 2010. So there were definitely access to better equipment, but it is a pretty on the run guerrilla style filmmaking. So having the low quality cameras, I think, was just what the equipment they had on hand. But it actually adds to the realism of the documentary. So even though it is low quality, the quality of the story is so strong that it doesn't take away anything. It actually adds to the reality of what's going on, because it's not a polished look at it. It doesn't look like a studio film. It doesn't look like a highly produced documentary. It looks like three guys that made a movie. And I think that adds to the genuineness of the story at hand. You can't really talk about production design because as far as I am aware, nothing was really dolled up. Everything feels real. So even if it is dolled up, that only adds to how good the film was, because it looks very real. Everything looks a little bit cluttered. Looks like somebody is living in every space that we're seeing. There is a solid amount of movement throughout the film as far as location goes. It basically is kind of split up into two chunks, and both of those environments are pretty dynamic and add to the story. Clearly they add to the story because that's what the story revolves around when they're in that location. But I will just say that I think that splits up the film pretty well, and moving to those two locations makes it a lot more of a dynamic watch. The most interesting thing about this film is the editing, because much of the actual story takes place online, which is not something that we can really show through the camera. So there is a lot of editing that is used to show what is happening online, screen recording type things where you can actually view it on the screen you're watching at home. And that's not something that was implemented very much before 2010. I'm not going to say that Catfish invented it. They didn't. I'm not going to say that Catfish popularized it. I also don't think that they did. But I think denying the impact of Catfish, both as in a cultural sense and a filmmaking sense, I think would be naive. They utilize technology in a very unique way. All of the uses of what is happening online are placed very, very well throughout the film. So I think that only added to make a more dynamic watch at home, especially in 2020. In reviewing a documentary, a lot of what a documentary is editing. You only have so much control over the story, but you do have control of what you show and what editing techniques are used. And I will say that the choice of shots here, obviously I have not seen all of the raw footage, but all of it works really well. Nothing overstays its welcome. Like I said, it's only an hour and a half, and all of it flows super naturally. The pacing is excellent. You never know what tone you're gonna get. The beginning is fun and light, and I was enjoying myself, and then it gets really tense, and I was sweating, and I had no idea what was happening, and then you get to a pretty pivotal moment in the film, and I won't talk about what tone that one goes for, because I think it's better as a surprise, but I will say it is a pretty drastic switch, and all of it feels natural to the story. None of it feels jarring in the filmmaking unless it is supposed to feel jarring. Additionally, there's some really great juxtaposition in what we're seeing and what we're hearing, particularly when you get to that latter half of the film, to show some of what is really going on versus what some of the characters might be telling us as an audience and to the actual filmmakers of the movie. So there's some really great juxtaposition in the editing, and I think the editing is some of the strongest from this film. The score is also really good for a documentary. I don't want to say it's rare, but it's not as often that I hear a documentary score that I might want to listen to elsewhere or that I recognize in tandem with the actual film. This one has a very fast-paced, intense score that feels very electronic-y, almost reminds you of dial-up. So there are elements to the score that I think enhance the themes of what the film is trying to say. Additionally, music and songs and singing and vocals play a pretty pivotal element to the story, and that works really well. And they share some of the songs both in a diegetic and non-diegetic sense, so I think that was really nice of them to do. The directing here I also think is pretty excellent. They feel pretty removed, pretty much of an objective spectator, but they are friends with the main character, so when they are interacting with our lead who are watching on screen, it feels really natural, and you get to know the filmmakers as characters, so even when they're not being objective necessarily, you understand what their motivations might be, and it doesn't influence your viewing of the film. It might influence the story, but you get the sense that they know that as well, and they're not trying to trick you into thinking it's more of an objective thing. So they're removed enough, but they are also directly involved in the story to the point that it makes it a little bit more entertaining, because it is like 3 20-something guys having fun with a new relationship, which is definitely an enjoyable watch. They also spend a lot of time building the characters, which I think is taken for granted a lot in documentaries like this that are shot in real time, where because we're seeing the events unfolding, you don't actually spend a lot of time with the characters one-on-one or just getting to know who they are. And so they spend a lot of time building the characters and building the relationships to the point where we know pretty much exactly who they are, or at least who they want us to know. And so they have an emphasis on character, even in a film that the characters aren't written, which I think is really nice. So now I'm going to start talking about the story. I won't spoil it right away, but I will mention when I'm going to start talking about spoilers, because it is very difficult to talk about this film without talking about spoilers. So to outline the story in a little bit more detail, Neve, all of this is true. So I'm saying as a character, because we're watching a film, but all of it is a true story. So Neve was a photographer, and particularly a photographer who focused on dance and ballet. He took a photograph that happened to be in a New York publication that got syndicated throughout the United States. And a young girl in Michigan named Abby sees the photograph and wants to paint it, so sends an email to Neve saying, hey, I loved this painting, could I paint it? A pretty adorable interaction. He obviously says yes. She sends him the painting. They strike up kind of a pen pal relationship. He speaks to the mother, and he speaks eventually to the older sister, Megan, who he starts to fall in love with. They start to have a much more romantic interaction, and then he decides to go visit them in Michigan. And so that's the extent of what you should know, maybe, going into it. If you haven't seen it, please go watch it. I can't say that enough. But the structure of the film is pretty original, given that I feel like there are 3 acts tonally. It's sort of like fun, tense, and then maybe a little bit downbeat afterwards. But the film kind of is blocked into 2 segments where it's like New York and Michigan, and they feel very distinct, very different. The beginning is really fun. It's really lighthearted. And okay, now I'm going to start to get into spoiler talk. So basically, the thing that I was not expecting at all, because I knew, if you're a fan of the show Catfish, or if you've seen the show Catfish or know who Neve is, you know that Megan is not Megan. Like, I knew that up front. It's somebody else. And so I was kind of like, okay, what does this film have to offer me if not the surprise that it's not Megan? And I think the thing that I was not expecting at all was there's a point before they even go to Michigan to visit Megan that they find out that it's not Megan. So I didn't know that that was going to happen. I figured that he knew the whole way and was going to get kind of like duped, bamboozled when he goes to Michigan. But they knew before they went. They actually decide to go to Michigan because they already know that she's not who she says she is. And once that happened, I was kind of like, oh, what's happening now? So they go to Michigan, and that's when it starts to get tense. It feels like a mystery. Like there might even be like some sort of like creepy thing going on. You don't actually know. And then they actually meet the woman who is pretending to be Megan, and the young girl Abby, who is a real girl but didn't ever send him any paintings. It was actually the mother, and the mother was pretending to be Megan the whole time. And when that happened, I was worried that they were going to meet it with sort of malicious intent, or sort of like a freak show thing where it's like, oh, hey, look at this freak, this weirdo, this creep. And it's really met with a lot of sympathy. It's just a very sympathetic documentary that I was like not expecting at all. I'm getting chills just like talking and thinking about it. It depicts like human relationships and romance and mental illness in a very kind, sympathetic light from the filmmaking standpoint, and never does any of the filmmakers or Neve call anybody out for anything that like happened, even if it might not have been the right thing to do. All of it is met really nicely, and you get to understand who this woman is and where she is coming from, and what might have led to it. I think it really ultimately is a film about human relationships, how the internet changes that, how other roadblocks might change that, like mental illness. I think there's a large conversation to be had with this film and mental illness. That's kind of a pretty prevalent theme, and ultimately what a lot of the film is about, which I thought was very fascinating. And although going into it, I might have wanted something a little bit more intense or crazy to happen, what actually unfolded, I think, was better than I could have predicted or imagined. So I really love this film. I also think the anecdote about where Catfish comes from is really fascinating. I'll leave that to the film. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. But I thought that was a pretty interesting thing that I obviously didn't know where the term came from, because it was created from this film, and now it's a pretty relevant term culturally. So I really love this film. I thought it was fantastic. I would recommend it to anybody, anywhere. Yeah, I was floored by this documentary. I was way, way better than I expected, and significantly better than a television show. I'll say that. So I'm going to give this film a solid 9 out of 10. It was great. It was awesome. Maybe even a strong 9. And upon maybe a rewatch or sitting with it longer, it might even get up there. It's definitely one of my favorite documentaries now. So that's Catfish. It is streaming for free on Netflix. Highly recommend it. And then next up is a movie that I recommend even more. One of my favorite not documentaries, sorry. I'm in the documentary mode. It's one of my favorite films ever made, called 500 Days of Summer. And then I'm going to be talking about the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope in film, and particularly romantic films. So that's the rest of the episode, but right now we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review of The Lovebirds and Catfish, both streaming right now on Netflix. I will now be giving my weekly recommendation, which is 500 Days of Summer. And finally, stay tuned until the very end, where I talk about the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope in film. So right now is 500... I always slur the name. I'm like, 500 Days of Summer, because I just assume everybody knows what I'm talking about. But it's 500 Days of Summer. It is a film from 2009, directed by Mark Webb, starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Zooey Deschanel. It follows Tom, a hopeless romantic who gets into a relationship and then an ensuing breakup with his coworker, Summer. And it just details that 500 days with or without Summer Finn. Right? I think her name's Summer Finn. I've seen this movie like a billion times, so I should know that. It doesn't say on IMDb. I'm pretty sure it's Summer Finn. Don't quote me. It's going to be very hard for me to be objective in this film because it is one of my favorites. It was my favorite film for a very long time. I think I've definitely grown past it in some ways. It's a little bit more of, I would say, maybe a little bit more of an immature film, but it was very formative for me. Definitely helped me through a lot of different things. And that's just an outlet that I think film can do for anybody, and everybody kind of has those films. So this is one of those films for me, and I will say why and what that might mean. So talking about it from just a screenplay standpoint to start, it is extremely creative. It is told out of order. So you start on day 1 and then you get to day 300, whatever. And because of that, it is much more focused on the emotion of a scene as opposed to the actual narrative of a scene. Obviously, there is a narrative that goes on, and telling it out of order only elevates that narrative, but you get a juxtaposition between different scenes based on the emotions that one is feeling, or what Tom is feeling. It is told explicitly from Tom's perspective. So in a lot of romantic films, you get a more of a holistic portrayal of the relationship. So you might get both people's perspectives. So in this case, you would get Summer and Tom. And although the film paints itself in a way that makes you think it is from an objective point of view, it is being told from Tom's perspective, and you get the sense of that because of all of the events that happen. No scene is without Tom. There are plenty of scenes without Summer. There's a narrator throughout the film that is supposed to serve as an objective spectator, but actually tends to criticize some of the things that Tom has going on, and I think is meant to focus on the fact that Tom is a very subjective spectator in this relationship, and therefore the film is also subjective from Tom's point, POV. The other thing that I find really fascinating as far as the screenplay goes is that it's much more of a coming-of-age film than it is a romance film, because it is told in that subjective lens and not from the perspective of both parties in the relationship. It is much more about Tom finding himself, whether it be through a relationship, through his work, and it actually tends to lean towards the latter in a lot of circumstances, but obviously the relationship was very formative to him and very important. But what's nice is that even though it is told through Tom's point of view, Summer is not a stock character. She is very fleshed out. She has her own desires, her own goals. She has agency within the story. And so we tend to get a sense of care and empathy both for Tom and Summer. Many people come out of this film rooting for Tom, maybe even villainizing Summer. Because I would say that I would think that many of you have seen this film. If you haven't, obviously recommend it. One of my favorites. But if you watch it or have watched it once or whatnot and come out on the side of Tom, I would recommend watching it again. I think that is a deceptive element of the film that may not be the most positive, but I do think that Tom is much more of a villain than he may have been painted upon initial release. And a lot of that actually comes from the performances. So Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Zooey Deschanel are both phenomenal in this film. They both have balanced and nuanced performances where you care about them, but they also do enough negative things that they are flawed human beings, and you can understand where they're coming from because of why we care about them, but you also can understand where some of their faults come in. And so they play both sides as opposed to putting one of their character into like one box, saying, I am a villain, I am a hero, I am whatnot, the side character. They all have very well-rounded characters, and that is just as much a credit to the screenplay as it is the acting and the performances. Additionally, the performances of everybody else are pretty strong. A lot of the side characters, I think, fit into boxes, particularly Tom's friend group. They are in it not all that much, but when they are, they're kind of playing one note, one kind of stock character. But there are also some other side characters, particularly that work with Tom and Summer, and all of them are pretty interesting and pretty funny. And so I think that all of the side characters also work in a way that enhance the relationship, because the film is so focused on the relationship that all of the side characters only bring out whether it be the positive or the negative in both Tom and Summer. Additionally, bringing back Tom and Summer, it's really focused on the emotional highs and lows of a relationship, and I think both parties play it extremely well. Whether they are on the same page in a certain scene or completely different pages, I think they exemplify how a relationship can go from a very high to a very low very quickly. They also just have moments that are extremely different from the scene before it, and how when you're comfortable with a person or you're supposed to be intimate with a person, how that can kind of bring out different sides of you. And I think they play it in a way that feels natural and doesn't feel out of place for their characters. Everything in the film is also influenced by their relationship, so that plays into the production design. The production design is really, really focused on the emotion of where they are within their relationship, and you can tell when watching a scene whether it is dimly lit or lightly lit, brightly lit. I don't know. But they also have colors that are associated with them. So Tom is associated with brown, Summer is associated with blue. So you can get the sense of where each character is within their storyline and within their influences on other characters based on some of the colors with the scene or the costuming. All of the costuming and all of the scenes also feel intentionally somewhat, okay, I'm not going to say boring, mundane, because I think it really is supposed to focus on how wonderful a relationship can feel and how everything else can only be heightened by that, even if you're in a mundane, quote-unquote, boring environment. There are some pretty memorable set pieces. Along with the filmmaking, I'll talk about this in just a second, there are very memorable shots, but there are also some pretty memorable spaces, whether it be the park or the office. If you've seen this movie more than once, you will definitely know them, and I think if you've seen it once, you would recognize a lot of the locations in the film. Moving on to the cinematography, there are very creative moments in the film, and because it's told in an unconventional, out-of-order way, they have the ability to kind of move around with what they want to do creatively from the film, like from the filmmaking aspect of it all. So one of those is like hand-drawn. Some of it is told in split screen. There is a phenomenal sequence that if you've seen the film, I'm sure you've seen it, and even if you haven't, it's a fairly popular scene that play Tom's expectations on an evening versus the actual reality of it side by side, which is a masterclass in both narrative storytelling and creative structure and cinematography. So there are a lot of creative aspects of the film, and what's nice is that they are spaced out enough but also frequent enough that none of them feel out of place. So there's also sort of a dance number animated scene, which is one of my favorite musical sequences in a film. And with splitting up each day by the emotion of it and saying what day it actually is, lends to the structure of it and creates the ability to have the more creative storytelling where it doesn't feel out of place. A lot of the cinematography is also very subjective towards Tom, whether it be actually very intimate and close up to Tom or what he is seeing, or framed in a way that seems holistic but based on the narrative and where the story is going. You can tell that it is still subjective, so the camera also plays into that. It goes kind of hand in hand with the narrator. The editing is wonderful. Because of the fact that it is told with the whole day by day thing, that could feel very choppy, but the scenes are different enough time-wise that it never feels choppy. It always flows really nice, which is really a credit to the editing. I think it would have been easy to edit this in a way that does not feel natural and feels forced or choppy, and it never feels like that. It is focused on the aesthetic of a scene and the emotion of the scene, so it cuts a lot of times on that, on the performances, focusing on the actual emotion of the actors. And because it is told out of order and edited that way, the whole movie kind of feels like a memory. It feels like he is recalling the relationship in a way that we might do when we're recalling things from our past, where it's like kind of segmented. We don't know where things are, like time-wise, and some is framed with rose-colored glasses, and some is very much not framed that way. So that kind of lends itself through the editing. The score is extremely memorable. It is light and airy and feels like a relationship, but it also has this level of dread throughout some of it, with some of the kind of secondary melodies and some of the other instrumentation as opposed to the actual kind of melody that is shown up front. But it is all pretty iconic, I would say, and if you know the film, you can associate it really well. All of the instruments are used in a way that enhance the relationship and focus on the kind of lovey-dovey aspect, and it feels that way within the score. And additionally, in a film that focuses on emotion, it is really important to have a strong soundtrack, and this one does. Some of the songs are well known, some of them are not quite as well known, and so it just kind of has a balance of wanting to pick good songs and not wanting to pick songs with name recognition. So all of them flow extremely naturally and work really well. And it also is pretty necessary in understanding the psyche, particularly of Tom and what he's feeling, because he's such a pop culture obsessed, influenced kid, guy, but he was influenced as a kid. So the music really lends itself to understanding where Tom is at this point in the film and the relationship. The only negative I will say, okay, maybe not only negative, the only negative for me, is I watched the director commentary for the first time, and what really stands out is that the film is really about a man or a boy becoming a man. I don't like that term as much, but like a guy, Tom, coming to terms with how relationships work as an adult, just in general, but not viewing it in an immature level and falling in love with the idea of somebody, but actually falling in love with somebody and listening to them and understanding them and not trying to put them in you are the one box and everything will work out because of that, and I'm going to mold you and you are exactly who I think you are. And that seems to pretty clearly be the thesis of the film. Obviously, films can have different theses depending on who is watching the film, but that's what it seems like to me. It really is about Tom coming to terms and maturing in a relationship sense and finding a lot of that care in himself, so that he won't project a lot of those things onto Summer and other women. But then in watching the director commentary, Mark Webb doesn't seem to understand that as well. There are a lot of moments in the commentary where he like objectifies Zooey Deschanel or undermines some of the like themes of the scene because of his own relationship, which the film is somewhat based off of. There's also a moment at the very beginning of the film with a little bit of a excerpt saying that it is not based on anybody in particular. That also kind of undermines what he's trying to say. So it seems like the film has a much greater message to be said that may not have even been intended by the director. I can't say that. I don't actually know that, but based on what he said in the director commentary, that seems to be the case. But from a director's standpoint, he blends genres and moments really well and seems to have a very strong understanding of time and how relationships work and how people interact with each other. He has also directed the Amazing Spider-Man series with Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, and despite all the criticism for that, a lot of people liked the relationship between Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy, and I think he has a really strong emphasis on relationships and creating good chemistry and really good character moments, so that stands out in 500 Days of Summer. So obviously, like I said, this film is very formative for me. It came in very pivotal points in my life, and almost every time that I've watched it, at a specific point in my life, I've changed either how I've viewed my own life or how I've viewed the film. I definitely, the first time watching it, came out, I was like, oh, this is really about how you can love and you can lose and it can be okay. And then I watched it again when I was a little bit older, a little more mature, and I was like, oh no, Tom sucks. This is much more about him becoming a mature adult and not objectifying women. So I've kind of changed my thoughts on how this film, or what this film means to me. And so clearly it means a lot to me. So this film is a little bit more of a subjective enjoyment, but I do think it is a very well-made film, as I have outlined in the rest of the review. And I would highly recommend it to anybody. I think it is fun. I think it is enjoyable. And I think it has a lot of lessons and a lot of themes that people can take into their own lives. So I think it's an excellent film. I really love 500 Days of Summer. I'm going to give this film a solid 10 out of 10 because, yeah, it's one of my favorites. Spider-Verse is still my favorite, so I'm not gonna, it has not, Spider-Verse overtook it. 500 Days of Summer was, sorry, I keep doing that. 500 Days of Summer was my favorite for a very long time, and then Spider-Verse overtook it. But they're both very good movies. Recommend them both. But 500 Days of Summer is my recommendation for this week because it is my favorite romance film. And now we're going to go on to our final segment, which is explaining the trope of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, which is very relevant to this film. I didn't mention it in the review because I'm going to talk about it right now. But if you don't know what the trope is, I will outline it. I will explain some of the history behind it and what it means in terms of film and Hollywood. So that's that. And right now we're going to take our final break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in, we're skipping around a little bit. I've given 3 different reviews, all based on romance. The first one was Lovebirds, streaming on Netflix. The second one was Catfish, also streaming on Netflix. And finally, my weekly recommendation was 500 Days of Summer. And now, because we're talking about romance films, one of my, I'm not going to say favorite, but one of the most intriguing tropes to me in romance films is the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. So many of you have probably heard this term. It is a very popular term as far as film goes, and it has definitely bled itself into culture and life in general. But I wanted to kind of review the history of it, where it comes from, its impact on film, and where it might be going, or where it might not be going. So, in giving you guys a little bit of a window into my life, who I am, I find this trope very fascinating because I kind of ran down when I was about 16, 17 in high school. I sort of like pinpointed some of my favorite movies, which at the time were like 500 Days of Summer, like I said earlier, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Scott Pilgrim, Her, and they were all kind of in my like top 10. And all of them have examples of or dissections of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, which I didn't even know was a thing at the time. And I was like, you know what? I should probably evaluate this. Like, why is this the case? Why do I keep liking films with the Manic Pixie Dream Girl? Those are all very good films, and it's not supposed to undermine that. But I was like, they're all in my favorites. I should probably figure out why. So I am a boy, a young boy. I'm very clearly the target of what the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is supposed to embody. Who its audience is sort of for, and I definitely fell into that kind of rabbit hole of enjoying it and enjoying sort of the idea and the romantic notion of having somebody that is like solely made for you, which is extremely toxic, not how relationships work, but is something that is made particularly for romantic films and something that I fell into. And as time moved on, I started to really enjoy films that kind of dissected that and said, why is this trope negative? Why is this a bad thing? Or what is its impact on relationships, on culture, and particularly on men? So I realize now that I also have not said what the Manic Pixie Dream Girl is. So if you don't already know, you can probably guess, but it is a term that was coined by an AV Club writer at the time named Nathan Rabin in 2007. It was in his review for Elizabethtown, which was a Cameron Crowe film, and it is a film trope that is outlined like this. It exists solely in the fevered imagination of sensitive young writer-directors to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and its infinite mysteries and adventures, which is absolutely scathing, first of all, and it is specifically a female film trope stock character that, like he outlined, is specifically made for men to feel better about themselves, kind of. Basically, as far as I understand it, it is a whimsical, opportunistic, optimistic female character who kind of takes a young, depressed, tortured man who has forgotten the joy in the world kind of under her wing and gives him the character arc that she doesn't get. She is a fairly two-dimensional character that doesn't really have any outstanding tropes or outstanding characteristics, other than all the ones previously outlined, and solely exists to advance the plot line of the man in the story without having one on her own, which is a pretty detrimental, pretty negative stock character, particularly in romantic films that should be from a more holistic point of view. Most of the time, obviously there are ones that come from different perspectives, but even if it comes from the man's perspective, you shouldn't have another character that doesn't have an arc or doesn't have any agency, particularly if its impact is fairly sexist. Although it was only coined in 2007, this trope has existed for a very long time. It was only kind of given that name recently. It is also commonly put onto Natalie Portman's character in Garden State, which a lot of the scenes from that are fairly difficult to watch. Pretty cringy, ultimately. But it is not only a harmful stereotype to have in a film because the woman doesn't get any agency in the story and, again, solely exists to advance the plot of the man. So not only is it a negative stereotype in that way, but it is also kind of manifested into this looming beast in film and culture to put onto any woman that exemplifies any of the character traits that you may see in a Manic Pixie Dream Girl. So the outgoing, quirky nature, lots of interests that are weird and out of the box, the like carefree, not like other girls quote stereotype. And so any female character in any film, whether it be about them or not, or a romantic film or not, that has any of these characteristics, the Manic Pixie Dream Girl has kind of become a catch-all term to lump everybody in. Any female character, more specifically, which really discredits some well-written, nuanced characters, strong female characters. Take, for example, Amelie in Amelie. The film is about her. She may be quirky and out of the box and outgoing and eccentric, but she has a very strong storyline. The film is strictly about her. And also a female character that has agency as far as a relationship goes and might want a relationship and want somebody else in her life is also not a negative. That's a strong desire for many, many people. And so discrediting certain characters by putting them in the Manic Pixie Dream Girl stereotype is just as harmful as the stereotype itself. So it originally existed as a very genuine, relevant critique of sexist stereotypes in romantic films in particular, but Nathan Rabin, who wrote it, actually disavows the term now. He wrote in a Salon article in 2014 about how it's become that catch-all term for anybody else. Another filmmaker who has kind of distanced herself from that term is Zoe Kazan, who wrote and starred in the film Ruby Sparks, which is an excellent dissection of the trope. And in recent years, actually not even recent years, well, the 21st century in particular, there have been multiple films that have kind of deconstructed the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. So 500 Days of Summer is one of those, mainly because it is from Tom's perspective. It is about him being influenced by pop culture, and so he actually tries to create Summer as a Manic Pixie Dream Girl when very clearly she's not. She states her desires, her goals, and he ignores them, thinks that he can change them because she's the one. So he sees her as a Manic Pixie Dream Girl, which is completely detrimental to their relationship. Another one is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is another one of my favorites because Kate Winslet's character is a very fascinating character, along with Jim Carrey, and their relationship is also very fascinating, and part of her outgoing, spontaneous nature is part of the reason they break up in the first place. And then the other example that I mentioned, Ruby Sparks, is one that is a little bit more underrated, but again, it was written by Zoe Kazan and stars her, about a writer who literally writes the girl of his dreams that then manifests into reality that he can change and sculpt and mold in any way that he wants. And it starts to become kind of a horror film, very creepy towards the end, and talks about how thinking that you can change somebody or create somebody into this perfect being for you is not only harmful to yourself, very harmful to them, and then harmful to the relationship, and create this really uneven power dynamic between men and women in a relationship. So that one is a very fascinating film that I would also highly recommend. And I think ultimately why this trope is so harmful in general is because it's a stock character. There are a lot of different stock characters: the goofy best friend, the evil stepmother. There's tons and tons of film tropes that lazy screenwriting is just going to put it in a film, of course. So a lot of people can chalk up the Manic Pixie Dream Girl to just lazy writing. But I've been kind of doing a lot of research recently on the difference between intent versus impact. And so although when writing a film, putting the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in as sort of just like a stock female character, particularly by male writers, first of all, obviously is lazy, but although there may not be any sexist intent in general from the filmmaker, that doesn't mean there isn't a sexist impact on the film world, on viewers, particularly on male viewers seeing other women depicted like this. So I think it is a harmful, sexist stereotype, but luckily it seems to be on its way out. We're reaching a point in film where many of the major films are good. Most new movies, I would say, like award season movies and even a lot of blockbusters tend to be at least enjoyable but well-written films. And so that means there's not going to be a lot of that lazy writing as far as character goes. And a lot of filmmakers are becoming much more aware of this stereotype, this trend, and you can see with the sort of films that dissect this film trope becoming a lot more popular or becoming made a lot more significantly. That also means that other writers and other filmgoers are going to become a lot more aware of this trope and some of its harmful impacts. And there hasn't been a lot of films, at least that I've seen, that have had the Manic Pixie Dream Girl in a long time, at least in a unironic, unexamined way. There are definitely still examples of it. Stargirl is a new film on Disney Plus, which I have not seen, so I will not say a lot about it. And I also won't say that it's a Manic Pixie Dream Girl from everything that I've read, and some of the other videos that I've seen seems to be that way. So it's not gone. It's not gone forever, but I would urge you to do your own research on the trope. Just becoming aware of some of these negative film tropes is a good thing because it will let you figure out when they occur in film, maybe even in your own writing to not put in this harmful stock character, and also will just make you more critical of the films that you watch in general. So that's not to say that some of these films aren't enjoyable that has this character, but to be aware of it and to not let it impact your own understanding of characters or even the world at large is very important to both critical thinking and just critical viewing of films. So that's the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. I think it is a very fascinating trope. I think luckily it is sort of on its way out. Hopefully that is the case. Hopefully there's not a resurgence of it, but becoming more critical and more aware of it, I think, is the right direction, and I would urge you to do some research on the trope as well. So that's the episode. That's the romantic episode of the GSMC movie podcast. So I have reviewed The Lovebirds, which is a newer film streaming on Netflix. I have also reviewed Catfish, a documentary from 2010, also streaming on Netflix. And then finally, I reviewed 500 Days of Summer. 500 Days of Summer, one of my favorite films of all time. And I outlined the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope and explained some of the history behind it. So that's today's episode. I hope that you all enjoyed it. If you have any feedback, if you enjoyed that final segment of explaining some film tropes, some film genres, please let me know. I would love to do that in the future. Let me know what you would want me to talk about. Some other ideas for this final segment. This is kind of open for anybody to give some of their ideas. I would love to make it a creative space for people to come up with some ideas for it. But as always, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you that you please remember to subscribe to the show and leave a nice review, because that really, really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I have been your host, Casey Baum. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.